Ever seen two grown men try to arrest a 6-year-old for drawing dinosaurs? Neither had I, until that Saturday afternoon. It was one of those perfect spring Saturdays in our quiet suburban neighborhood. The kind where the birds are chirping, the lawnmowers are humming, and kids are playing outside like it's still the 1980s. My son, Liam, was crouched on the sidewalk outside our house, completely absorbed in his masterpiece. A giant blue T-Rex drawn with sidewalk chalk. He was so proud of it, too. He even added tiny stick figures running away from the dinosaur, which he said were bad guys. I was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, enjoying the rare moment of peace. You know how it is, life gets busy, and you don't always get to appreciate the little things. Watching Liam's creativity unfold felt like one of those moments you want to freeze in time. But just as I thought this day couldn't get any better, a black SUV rolled up out of nowhere. It wasn't just any SUV. It had tinted windows and that ominous slow crawl that immediately makes you suspicious. At first, I thought maybe it was a delivery driver or someone lost looking for directions. But when the vehicle stopped right in front of our house and two men stepped out wearing unmarked uniforms with HOA patches slapped on their sleeves, I knew something wasn't right. They looked official enough to fool someone who wasn't paying attention. Polished boots, clipboards in hand, but there was something off about them. Their uniforms didn't have any identifying logos or names, and their demeanor screamed, wannabe authority. The taller one marched straight up to Liam and barked, "Hey, you can't be doing that here. It's vandalism." His tone was sharp enough to make Liam freeze mid-doodle. The wiry one followed close behind and added, "You're defacing HOA property. We're going to have to take you to HOA security." Wait, what? HOA security? For sidewalk chalk? At first, I thought it was some kind of prank. Maybe these guys were filming a hidden camera show or trying to scare kids for laughs. But when the wiry man reached down and grabbed Liam's arm, my stomach dropped. This wasn't a joke, they were serious. Liam yelped in confusion, his little face scrunching up as tears started welling in his eyes. He tried to pull away from the man's grip but couldn't break free. My heart raced as I stood up from the porch so fast I nearly spilled my coffee. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" I shouted, my voice shaking with equal parts anger and disbelief. The taller man turned to me with a smug look and said something about violating HOA regulations and disciplinary action. Disciplinary action? For a 6-year-old? Over chalk art? This had to be some kind of sick joke? Or these guys were completely unhinged. And yet, there they were, two grown men trying to intimidate a child over a drawing of a dinosaur. Now let me ask you, what would you do if you saw two strangers grabbing your child and barking orders about fake rules? Would you confront them head-on or call for backup? Drop your thoughts below. I'm genuinely curious how others would react in this situation. I took a step forward, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "Let go of him right now," I yelled again, louder this time. But they ignored me completely like I wasn't even there. The wiry man tightened his grip on Liam's arm, while the taller one continued lecturing me about property damage and unauthorized activities. At this point, neighbors started peeking out their windows and stepping onto their porches to see what all the commotion was about. Some pulled out their phones to record what was happening. A mix of curiosity and concern spreading through the street like wildfire. I glanced at Liam again, his small frame trembling as he looked back at me with wide eyes full of fear, and something inside me snapped. I took another step toward them, ready to grab my son back by force if necessary. But before I could make my move, I heard the sound of our front door creaking open behind me. My dad stepped out onto the porch. Now let me tell you something about my dad. Ron Sanderson doesn't do drama. He doesn't do nonsense either. He's a retired Army veteran who spent decades commanding troops in situations far more intense than this suburban HOA circus act. And when he walked out onto that porch, calm as ever, I knew these guys had no idea who they were messing with. Ron Sanderson doesn't rush. He doesn't need to. When my dad stepped out onto the porch that day, he carried himself with the kind of calm confidence that only comes from years of experience. Experience that most people wouldn't want to test. He didn't say a word at first, just stood there in his old jeans and a faded army t-shirt, arms crossed, surveying the scene like he was sizing up a couple of rookies who'd wandered into the wrong battlefield. The taller man, the one who'd been barking about vandalism, glanced at my dad and hesitated for just a moment. It was subtle, but I caught it. That brief flicker of doubt in his eyes, like he wasn't quite sure what he was dealing with now. The wiry guy, still holding Liam's arm, didn't seem to notice. He was too busy trying to look tough, even though his grip on my son was starting to loosen. Maybe he thought Dad was just another suburban grandpa who'd come out to complain about the noise. Big mistake. Dad finally broke the silence. His voice was low and steady, but it carried an edge that could cut through steel. "Let go of the boy," he said. The wiry man blinked, clearly caught off guard by how calm Dad sounded. He looked at his partner for guidance, but the taller guy didn't say anything. Maybe he didn't like the way Dad was staring at him, like he could see straight through him. "I said," Dad repeated, taking one slow step forward. "Let go of him, now." The wiry man let out a nervous laugh, trying to recover his composure. "We're with the HOA," he said, holding up his clipboard like it was some kind of badge. "This kid's violating community regulations by defacing property. We're authorized to." "You're not authorized to touch my grandson," Dad cut in sharply. "And unless you've got a court order or an actual law enforcement badge in that clipboard of yours, I suggest you back off." The taller man finally found his voice and stepped forward, trying to reassert control of the situation. "Look," he said, holding up his hands in what I assume was meant to be a calming gesture. "We're just enforcing HOA rules here. It's nothing personal." Dad raised an eyebrow. "HOA rules? Which ones?" The man hesitated again, clearly not expecting to be challenged on specifics. Section 14B, he said after a moment. "No defacement of common property." "Common property?" Dad asked, gesturing toward our driveway and sidewalk chalk drawing. "This is private property." "Well," the man stammered, "the sidewalk falls under HOA jurisdiction." "Does it?" Dad asked coolly. "Because last I checked, this sidewalk is maintained by the city, not your little homeowners association." He took another step forward, and this time both men instinctively stepped back. At this point, a few neighbors had started gathering on their porches or lawns to watch what was happening. Some were recording on their phones. Others were whispering to each other. I could see Mrs. Jenkins from 2 houses down shaking her head like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The wiry man finally let go of Liam's arm and took a step back, muttering something under his breath about, "Just doing our job." Liam ran straight to me and buried his face in my leg, still trembling but clearly relieved to be out of their grasp. Dad wasn't done yet. "Let me see some identification," he said firmly. Both men froze. "What?" the taller one asked. "You heard me," Dad said. "If you're claiming to represent the HOA, then you should have some kind of ID or documentation proving who you are and what authority you have." The wiry man fumbled with his clipboard for a moment before handing over a piece of paper that looked like it had been printed off a home computer 5 minutes earlier. Dad took it without saying a word and studied it for a few seconds before letting out a short laugh. "This isn't an official document," he said, holding it up for everyone to see. "It doesn't even have an HOA letterhead or signatures." He handed it back with a look of utter disdain. "You two aren't with the HOA." The taller man bristled at that. "Of course we are," he snapped. "We've been hired by the board to enforce." "No," Dad interrupted him again, his voice rising just slightly for the first time. "You're not with the HOA because if you were, you'd know that this neighborhood doesn't even allow third-party enforcement agencies without prior written approval from all homeowners." He glanced around at the growing crowd of neighbors for confirmation before turning back to the men. "Which means you're either lying or trespassing, or both." That did it. The wiry man turned pale as a sheet while his partner tried, and failed, to come up with a response. They both looked like they wanted nothing more than to climb back into their SUV and disappear before things got any worse for them. But Dad wasn't gonna let them off that easy. "You've got 30 seconds to get off this property," he said coldly. "And if I ever see either of you near my family again." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. but there wasn't a person within earshot who didn't understand exactly what he meant. The two men exchanged panicked glances before practically tripping over each other in their rush to get back into their SUV. They peeled out so fast they left skid marks on the street, and not one person watching felt sorry for them. As soon as they were gone, Dad turned back toward me and Liam with that same calm expression he'd had when this whole thing started. "You okay?" he asked Liam gently. Liam nodded but didn't say anything. He was still clutching my leg like his life depended on it. "Good," Dad said simply before turning toward the small crowd of neighbors who were still watching from their porches and driveways. "If anyone else sees those guys around here again," he called out loudly enough for everyone to hear, "call the police immediately." He paused for effect before adding dryly, "And maybe remind them that impersonating an officer is a felony." That got a few chuckles from the crowd, and more than one round of applause. But Dad didn't stick around for any congratulations or pats on the back. He just walked back into the house as if nothing unusual had happened at all. That's Ron Sanderson for you. Quiet, effective, and absolutely not someone you want to mess with. And as I stood there holding Liam close while our neighbors slowly dispersed back into their homes, I couldn't help but feel grateful. Not just for what my dad had done today, but for everything he's taught me about standing up for what's right. No matter how ridiculous or dangerous the situation might be. The taller man made the mistake of stepping forward. His chest puffed out like he still had some control over the situation. "Listen," he said, his voice dripping with fake authority. "We're just doing our job here. You don't want to escalate this." Dad didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply squared his shoulders and said, "You've already escalated it when you put your hands on my grandson." The wiry man, clearly rattled but still trying to recover some semblance of control, pointed a finger at Dad. "You don't understand how this works," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "We're authorized to enforce HOA rules. If you interfere, we'll have to file a report with the board." Dad tilted his head slightly, like he was trying to decide whether to laugh or let loose. "File a report?" he repeated, his voice calm but laced with sarcasm. "Go ahead. File all the reports you want. But first..." He took one deliberate step forward, closing the distance between him and the wiry man. "Let's talk about how you think it's okay to grab a 6-year-old. The wiry man took a step back, his confidence visibly crumbling under Dad's unrelenting gaze. The taller man, apparently deciding that intimidation was still an option, reached out and placed a hand on Dad's chest. That was it. In one fluid motion, Dad grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it behind his back, and swept his legs out from under him. The guy hit the pavement with a thud that echoed down the street. A collective gasp went up from the neighbors who were still watching from their porches and lawns. The wiry man froze for a second, clearly unsure whether to run or fight. He chose wrong. He lunged at Dad, probably thinking he could catch him off guard while he was pinning the taller guy to the ground. But Dad was ready. He sidestepped the wiry man's clumsy attack and used his momentum against him, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him into the side of their SUV. "Stay down," Dad growled, his voice low and commanding. The wiry man didn't argue. He slumped against the SUV, breathing hard and clutching at his shirt like he couldn't believe what had just happened. Meanwhile, the taller guy was writhing on the ground, clutching his arm and groaning in pain. "You broke my wrist," he whined. Dad leaned down slightly, just enough to look him in the eye. "No," he said evenly. "If I'd broken your wrist, you wouldn't be able to move it at all." At that moment, I realized something important about my dad. He wasn't just defending Liam. He was sending a message, not just to these two clowns, but to anyone who thought they could come into our neighborhood and throw their weight around without consequences. By now, several neighbors had come closer to get a better look at what was happening. Some were still recording on their phones. Others were talking amongst themselves in hushed tones. I even saw Mr. Peterson from across the street shaking his head and muttering something about how these HOA types always take things too far. And then we heard it, the sound of sirens in the distance. The wiry man's eyes widened in panic as he realized what was about to happen. "You called the cops?" he asked no one in particular. "No," Dad said calmly as he straightened up and crossed his arms again. But I'm glad someone did. The police arrived within minutes. 2 squad cars pulling up with lights flashing but no sirens blaring anymore. 4 officers stepped out, their hands resting on their belts as they surveyed the scene. One of them, a tall woman with a no-nonsense expression, approached Dad first. "Sir," she said, her tone professional but wary. "Can you tell me what's going on here?" Dad nodded and gestured toward Liam, who was still clinging to my leg, but looking slightly less terrified now that help had arrived. "These 2 men," Dad said, pointing at the wiry guy slumped against the SUV and the taller guy still lying on the ground, "were harassing my grandson and tried to take him away under the pretense of enforcing HOA rules." The officer frowned and turned toward the 2 men. "Is that true?" she asked. The wiry man shook his head frantically. "No, we're with the HOA. We were just trying to enforce regulations." "Do you have any identification?" she interrupted. He hesitated for a moment before reaching into his pocket and pulling out what looked like a laminated badge of some kind. The officer took it from him and examined it closely before handing it off to one of her colleagues. "This isn't an official ID," she said flatly. "It's issued by our company." The wiry man protested weakly. "And what company is that?" she asked. "Neighborhood Compliance Services," he mumbled. "Never heard of it," she replied before turning back to Dad. "Do you have video evidence of what happened?" I pulled out my phone without hesitation and handed it over to her. Several other neighbors stepped forward as well, offering their own footage of the incident. As she reviewed the videos, her expression hardened. When she finished watching them all, she turned back toward her colleagues and nodded once. "Arrest them both," she said simply. "What?" The wiry man yelped as one of the officers stepped forward to cuff him. "You can't do this. We're just doing our job. Your job doesn't include impersonating law enforcement or attempting to kidnap a child," she replied coldly. The taller guy tried to protest as well but quickly gave up when another officer helped him to his feet, none too gently, and started reading him his rights. As they were led away toward one of the squad cars, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Liam let go of my leg for the first time since this whole ordeal started and looked up at me with wide eyes. "Are they going to jail?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said firmly. "They are." Dad didn't say anything. He didn't need to, but I could see a small hint of satisfaction in his expression as he watched them being driven away in handcuffs. One of our neighbors, a middle-aged man named Steve who'd always been vocal about how much he hated dealing with HOA nonsense, walked over and clapped Dad on the shoulder. "Ron," he said with a grin, "you're my hero." Dad shrugged like it was no big deal before turning back toward me and Liam. "Let's go inside," he said simply. And just like that, it was over, or so we thought at the time. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing incessantly. Texts, missed calls, and notifications were pouring in faster than I could keep up. Apparently, the neighborhood group chat had exploded overnight with everyone talking about what had happened. Videos of the incident were circulating like wildfire, and people were furious, not just at the 2 men who had been arrested but at the HOA board itself. By mid-morning, I'd already received 3 emails from neighbors asking if we planned to file a formal complaint against the HOA. Others wanted to know if there was a way to get rid of the board entirely. It seemed like everyone had their own story about how the HOA had overstepped its boundaries in one way or another: unreasonable fines for minor infractions, threats of legal action over landscaping choices, and even rumors of board members pocketing funds meant for community improvements. But here's the kicker. When I finally sat down to review our HOA bylaws, I realized something shocking. There was absolutely no provision in the rules that allowed for third-party enforcement agencies like Neighborhood Compliance Services. In fact, the bylaws explicitly stated that all enforcement actions had to be handled directly by the board or through official legal channels, not by random contractors claiming authority over homeowners. That raised an even bigger question. Who were these guys really working for? I decided to dig deeper. The first thing I did was call the HOA president, a man named Greg Whitman who'd been in charge for as long as I could remember. Greg wasn't exactly known for being approachable. He had a reputation for being more concerned with maintaining control than fostering community spirit, but I figured he'd at least want to know what had happened. When he answered the phone, his tone was curt and dismissive. "I've already heard about the incident," he said before I could even finish explaining why I was calling. "Those men weren't authorized by the board. It's not our problem." "Not your problem?" I repeated incredulously. "They claimed they were enforcing HOA regulations and tried to take my son. How is that not your problem?" Greg sighed heavily, like he was annoyed that he even had to deal with this. "Look," he said, "I don't know who hired them or why they were in your neighborhood, but I can assure you it wasn't us." Something about his tone didn't sit right with me. He sounded defensive, like he was trying to distance himself from the situation as much as possible without actually addressing it. "Then how did they get access to our HOA bylaws?" I asked pointedly. "They quoted specific sections during the confrontation." Greg hesitated for just a moment before replying, "Those documents are public record. Anyone can access them if they know where to look." That might have been true, but it still didn't explain why these men had targeted our neighborhood specifically, or why they seemed so confident in their authority despite having no legitimate credentials. I hung up feeling more frustrated than ever. If Greg wasn't willing to take responsibility for what had happened, or even investigate it, then it was up to me to figure out the truth on my own. Over the next few days, I spent hours researching neighborhood compliance services online, trying to find any information about who they were or what they did. At first, all I could find were vague references to similar incidents in other neighborhoods. Stories about homeowners being harassed by fake inspectors demanding payment for bogus violations or threatening legal action over minor infractions like mailbox placement or fence height. But then I stumbled across an article from a local news outlet in another state detailing a nearly identical scheme. Two men posing as HOA enforcers had been caught extorting money from residents under false pretenses. According to the report, they'd been operating under the guise of a legitimate company but were actually part of an organized crime ring targeting affluent suburban communities across multiple states. The more I read, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern designed to exploit homeowners who didn't know their rights or were too intimidated to push back against authority figures claiming jurisdiction over their property. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to take action. First, I reached out to local law enforcement and shared everything I'd found, including copies of our HOA bylaws and video evidence from the confrontation with Liam. The officer handling my case seemed genuinely interested in pursuing it further and promised to follow up with their investigations unit to see if there were any connections between our incident and similar cases in other neighborhoods. Next, I contacted several neighbors who'd expressed concerns about HOA overreach and invited them over for an informal meeting at my house. To my surprise, nearly a dozen people showed up, including some who'd never spoken out publicly about their frustrations before but felt emboldened by what had happened. As we shared stories and compared notes, it became clear that this wasn't just about two rogue contractors. It was about something much bigger: accountability. Several neighbors agreed to help draft a formal petition demanding transparency from the HOA board regarding its enforcement practices and financial management policies. Others volunteered to contact local media outlets and share their experiences in hopes of raising awareness about similar issues in other communities. By the end of the meeting, we'd formed a small but determined coalition committed to holding our HOA accountable. Not just for what had happened with Liam, but for years of unchecked power and questionable decision-making. In the weeks that followed, our efforts began to pay off. Local news stations picked up our story and ran segments highlighting both the confrontation with Liam and broader concerns about HOA abuse across suburban America. Social media platforms lit up with comments from people sharing their own experiences dealing with overzealous boards or shady contractors posing as enforcers. And then came the breakthrough. Law enforcement announced that they'd uncovered evidence linking neighborhood compliance services to a larger network involved in extortion schemes targeting homeowners across multiple states, including several cases where victims had been pressured into paying thousands of dollars in fines or fees for violations that didn't even exist. The two men who'd harassed Liam were formally charged with impersonating officers and attempted kidnapping, and their arrest led investigators straight to several higher-ups within their organization who'd been orchestrating similar scams nationwide. It wasn't just justice, it was vindication. For years, many of us had felt powerless against an HOA system that seemed designed more for control than community. But now we knew we weren't alone and we weren't powerless anymore. As news of the arrests spread throughout our neighborhood and beyond, something remarkable began to happen. People started speaking out, not just against HOAs, but against any system that prioritized authority over accountability or profit over people. And while there's still plenty of work left to do, for our neighborhood and countless others, I can honestly say that what started as one terrifying afternoon has turned into something far greater than any of us could have imagined. A movement toward fairness and freedom in communities everywhere. The day the verdict came in, it felt like the entire neighborhood had been holding its breath. For weeks, we'd followed every update, every court hearing, every new piece of evidence that came to light. And now, justice had finally been served. The two men who had harassed Liam were sentenced to prison for impersonating officers, attempted kidnapping, and fraud. But the real victory wasn't just their punishment. It was the ripple effect their arrest had created. In the weeks following their sentencing, law enforcement revealed just how deep this scheme had gone. Neighborhood Compliance Services wasn't some fly-by-night operation. It was part of a larger criminal network that had been targeting suburban neighborhoods across multiple states for years. They'd exploited the fear and confusion surrounding HOA rules to extort money from unsuspecting homeowners, using intimidation tactics and fake legal threats to get what they wanted. And our little neighborhood had played a key role in bringing them down. But while the legal system dealt with those two men and their associates, our community had its own reckoning to face. The scandal had exposed deep cracks in the way our HOA operated, cracks that many of us had ignored or tolerated for far too long. It wasn't just about rogue contractors or shady enforcement practices. It was about accountability, transparency, and trust. The petition we'd started after the incident gained traction quickly. Within days, we'd gathered enough signatures to force a special meeting of the HOA board. It was standing room only in the community center that night, with neighbors who'd never attended a single meeting suddenly showing up in droves. People were angry. Angry about how the board had handled or failed to handle the situation with Liam, angry about years of unexplained fees and arbitrary rules, angry about feeling powerless in their own homes. Greg Whitman, the HOA president, tried to maintain his usual air of authority as he addressed the crowd. But it was clear from the start that he was out of his depth. Every time he tried to deflect a question or shift blame onto someone else, another neighbor would stand up with receipts, literal receipts, of fines they'd paid or complaints they'd filed that had gone unanswered. One woman brought up how she'd been fined $200 for having her trash cans visible from the street on collection day, a rule that wasn't even in the bylaws. Another man shared how he'd been threatened with legal action for planting flowers that weren't on the approved landscaping list. And then there was Mrs. Jenkins, who revealed that she'd been charged hundreds of dollars in administrative fees for contesting a violation notice she later proved was issued in error. By the time it was my turn to speak, Greg looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. I stood up and told everyone exactly what had happened to Liam. The fake HOA cops, the bogus regulations they'd cited, and how Greg himself had brushed me off when I called him for answers. I held up a copy of our bylaws and pointed out all the ways they'd been ignored or misinterpreted over the years to suit the board's agenda. "This isn't just about my son," I said, my voice steady but firm. "This is about all of us. We pay our dues every month expecting that money to be used for our benefit, not to line someone's pockets or fund power trips disguised as enforcement actions. It's time we take back control of our community." The room erupted into applause. By the end of the meeting, Greg and several other board members had resigned under pressure. A temporary committee was formed to oversee HOA operations until new elections could be held. And this time, people actually cared about who was running for those positions. Instead of rubber-stamping candidates who were only interested in maintaining control, we chose neighbors who were committed to fairness, transparency, and collaboration. But perhaps the most meaningful change came from within our own community. The incident with Liam had reminded us all of something we'd lost sight of, that we're not just individuals living side by side, we're a neighborhood. And when we stand together, there's nothing we can't accomplish. One Saturday morning, not long after everything settled down, I walked outside to find Liam sitting on the sidewalk with his chalk again. This time, though, he wasn't alone. A group of kids from down the street had joined him, each one working on their own little masterpiece, while their parents stood nearby chatting and laughing like old friends. Liam looked up at me with a big grin and said, "Dad, look, we're making a whole dinosaur world." Sure enough, there were T-Rexes and Triceratopses and even a few pterodactyls scattered across the pavement in bright blues and greens and yellows. It was messy and chaotic and absolutely perfect. Later that day, one of our neighbors suggested turning Liam's original T-Rex drawing into something permanent, a mural on our driveway as a symbol of resilience and community spirit. Everyone pitched in to make it happen. Some brought paint supplies. Others helped sketch out designs or keep an eye on the kids while we worked. When it was finished, I stood back and looked at what we'd created together. A giant blue T-Rex surrounded by smaller dinosaurs representing each family in our neighborhood. It wasn't just a piece of art. It was a reminder of everything we'd been through and everything we'd accomplished by standing together. As for my dad, he took all the attention in stride, just like he always does. When reporters showed up asking for interviews or neighbors stopped by to thank him for what he did that day, he'd just shrug and say something like, "I did what anyone would have done, but we all knew better." Ron Sanderson wasn't just anyone. He was exactly who we needed when everything went sideways. And while he might not think of himself as a hero, he hates that word, I know Liam will always remember his grandpa as one, and so will I. So if there's one thing I've learned from this whole experience, it's this: never underestimate what you can accomplish when you stand up for what's right, and never underestimate your neighbor's ability to rally around you when you need them most. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this story or found it inspiring in any way, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. It really helps us out. Don't forget to leave a comment below letting us know your thoughts or sharing your own experiences with HOA drama. I love reading your stories, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss any future videos. Thanks again for being here. I'll see you next time.